So we start with kind of the gross and net migration for the year. Probably this, a lot of people are quite familiar with this already. So you'll see that there was about a 41% increase in immigration in the year, up to 141,000. About 42,000 of those are Ukrainian. So this is April to April. These are Central Statistics Office statistics. And also an increase in immigration of 14%, which led to kind of the highest net migration since before the crash of 77,000. If we look then at kind of where people are coming from, you'll see that a lot of the increase in 2022 and 2021 was really an increase in the rest of the world category. And a lot of that is explained by the Ukrainian numbers, but you'll see that also we're seeing changes in how employment permit issuing as well. So we'll have a look at that. But you'll see that again, the number of the EU numbers have remained quite steady, and still about about 29,000 is accounted for by Irish nationals. But you will see kind of quite a distinct difference from the previous high in 2007, when a lot of the immigration was EU immigration. A lot more now is from the rest of the world category. If we drill down then into this kind of non-EU migration, these are the first permit statistics from Eurostat. So first permits are only offered to people from outside of the EU. And so we were able to look at the reasons that those were granted. And we see that education continues to dominate. So it's 48% of the first permits that were granted in 2022 were for education reasons, and then smaller percentages, but again, for employment and the other category, which covers a lot of different things, but education is really kind of continues to be the headline figure there. If we look then at employment permits, just to show this trend over time, so employment permits are issued again to non-EU workers. So this doesn't cover those who are coming from the EU. And we see this really strong increase over time. So from the previous high of 16,000 to now about 40,000, we saw a really big jump in 2022. And a lot of this is kind of a response to labour market shortages and changes to the lists that are used to manage employment permits in Ireland, which were quite strongly expanded, kind of what sectors could qualify for an employment permit over the last few years. And we see this subsequent jump. To show kind of where those employment permits are being issued, then we can look at the sectors. So the healthcare sector is usually the highest one, but the information and communication have just edged above it, as you'll see, with 27% of employment permits for 2022. So between kind of information and communication and health and social work, that accounts for about half of the permits. But if you will look kind of across the sectors, there is a strong increase in quite a lot of sectors on the employment permit list, and we do have that table in the annual report if you're curious about the other sectors as well. Moving on then to international protection. So this is probably one that a lot of people are quite familiar with. It's gotten a lot of attention. 2022 saw the highest number of international protection applications in Ireland's history, with 13,651. If this graph went back a bit further, or quite a bit further, we'd see that there was also quite a large increase at the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, which then kind of subsequently decreased. So it's not that this is, a completely unprecedented flow, but in the last number of years, in particular, compared with the COVID-19 years, 2020 and 2021, where we saw, quite the impact of travel restrictions, it is a very large flow. So a 415% increase from 2021. And looking then at kind of the system around international protection. And just to clarify, that does not include Ukrainians. So this is those who are applying for international protection. Temporary protection is a separate framework, and we will look at the figures of those in just a moment. But then to look at the decisions around international protection, you'll see that 2022 also saw quite a significant increase in decision-making capacity. So these are the first instance decisions that are issued by the Ministerial Decision Unit in the Department of Justice as a result of a recommendation from the International Protection Office generally. And you see that the total has increased quite significantly to almost 4,500 compared with previous years. to kind of scale up to try and meet that demand. And we see that about 80% of them were positive decisions. This is also related to how these statistics are reported. That's really important. There are some clarifications in the annual reports on that when they are appealed, it's a slightly different category, but we are seeing a lower number than the previous 2 years, which had been somewhat artificially inflated because there was a pause on issuing negative decisions because of the COVID-19 restrictions and pandemic. So a lot of negative recommendations that had been made were not issued as decisions yet in 2020 and 2021. So we're seeing this kind of lowering of that positive decision rate as well. If we look then at secondary movements, so this is basically when someone enters the EU as an applicant and comes to Ireland having already entered another European country, is what we call a secondary movement. And what we see is when we look at the secondary movement of applicants to Ireland, we actually are seeing a decrease, especially from 2019. But what we do see is quite a significant increase in the secondary movements of beneficiaries. So these are people who have already been recognised in other European countries as refugees, but who do not have a right to move to live and work. And we'll see there were some policy updates as well about the right to move for this group. But we see a really significant increase since 2020 from quite a low base before. So we're about somewhere around 1,900 in 2022. And there's very little research on secondary movements of beneficiaries. It's quite a lot more on secondary movements of applicants. This somewhat predictably then led to a very significant increase in accommodation that IPAS was providing. So this is the International Protection Accommodation Service, who provide accommodation for international protection applicants. So we see that in 2019, they were providing somewhere around 7,000 places, kind of beds. And towards the end of the year, it was almost 20,000. The latest statistics show that last week that was 26,000. So this kind of, this flow is being seen then in accommodation challenges. And then looking at temporary protection, this is, a lot of us are very familiar with the numbers on temporary protection, I think, but we did see kind of once the directive was triggered, which we'll cover a little bit in the development section, we saw this really sharp increase in arrivals that then kind of tapered off quite quickly. And this is now weekly arrivals up until the end of December last year. Where these are being registered, I thought this was quite an interesting, these were quite interesting statistics published by the Central Statistics Office on, this is based on PPS number allocations. So we see really that there's a concentration in Dublin and also kind of the west and the northwest of where Ukrainian PPS numbers are being registered. So there's a couple of others then that I just want to cover, and one is unaccompanied minors referred to TUSLA. So this we see a really significant increase again, and this is actually excluding the Ukrainians. So there's a total of 597 referrals. We excluded Ukrainians from this graph just for comparability to show that through the standard unaccompanied minors, there's also been a really significant increase. And what we see is a 200% increase in the number of people in the care of TUSLA under this specific program. And we saw some challenges with the care provision as a result of that. Citizenship acquisition then, we see an increase in applications, not a very significant one, and we also see an increase in certificates issued. As in the last few years, the top nationality is those from the UK, as it has been quite relatively often since the Brexit referendum. And then these are just a few key statistics from the monitoring report on integration to show you some of the numbers on integration. I really recommend looking through this report in more detail, but it's quite a mixed picture on integration is kind of what the key indicators are painting. On one side, you have a higher employment rate and kind of a higher third level education rate than Irish nationals. But on the other side, we have lower net income adjusted for household size. We have a higher risk of poverty rate, lower home ownership, and higher kind of housing affordability issues, defined as those spending more than 30% on housing. And then the final one I believe that we're going to look at is deportation orders. So what we saw, of course, with the COVID-19 travel restrictions was a really steep decline in deportation orders. The Department of Justice largely paused deportation orders, except, is my understanding, in cases of quite serious crime. And that kind of pause went on until kind of the middle of 2022. So we see that the numbers still haven't recovered because there has been a much more limited time that these are being issued. And it still hasn't kind of gone back to pre-pandemic numbers in 2022.